begin, those of you who were in Vietnam last year may remember that we looked at the economics of the finishing herd. So today we're going to look at the economics of the sow herd and the finishing herd together. So we have a lot to do. We've got 40 minutes to do it. And not only are we covering an expansive set of material, but I'm going to try to convince you that the way you're probably thinking about cost needs to undergo some radical revision. We know that coming very shortly in the future, we're going to have much more data than we have today on individual animals. Today, because of the technology which is used, we normally do not measure individual animal intake of feed, for instance, or daily gain, that sort of thing. Often we don't know the outcome of the animal until a buyer actually measures it and pays us for it and tells us how much it weighed. So that's changing, and it's going to change rapidly. And we're going to usher in a time of precision, away from kind of batch averaging and into precision. So I want to share with you today a way of understanding the economics of PRRS in the sow herd and the finishing herd, which matches the coming complexity, which matches the coming reality of what's really going on. We just can't measure it now. So this may be your first look into the real economics of the sow herd. So as we begin, I want to talk about two big movements in economics that we think about when we understand the impact of something like a disease in pigs. The first is that disease organisms tend to slow the turning of the farm. We think about the sow herd as a cycle of activity, from weaning to wean to service to gestation, farrowing, weaning again as a circle. This process gets slowed when disease comes, especially PRRS. So the rate at which individual sows are producing output slows down. When we think about the finishing herd, the same thing happens. Typically, PRRS creates inappetence, or a lack of appetite, in the animals as they become sick and have a fever and so on. And so they eat less, they grow slower. And therefore, the normal time that it would take to finish the animals and harvest them is extended. Now, if you're in a system where animals are coming behind them and are pushing these out, you will have to forfeit the animals at a much lower weight. If you have the time to keep the animals and let them grow at their slower rate, you wind up with fewer turns of the building. So if your finisher can turn 2.5 times a year, it may slow to 2.1. So this is asset efficiency. We call this asset efficiency. The second major thing which happens is the cost change. Now, let's talk about this because many producers misunderstand the difference between unit costs and variable costs. When we talk about unit costs, we talk about all of the costs invested in buildings and equipment and so on. So if we have fewer animals produced because the turn is slower, then we divide fewer animals into that cost of the buildings. And therefore, even though the building cost doesn't rise, the allocation of the cost to individual animals gets larger because there are fewer of them to receive the cost. Beyond the fixed cost, though, there's an increase in variable costs. So this would be like cost of veterinary expense, cost of additional labor to work with sick animals or remove dead animals. We may have increased biosecurity practices, which are more costly and so on. So we have two big movements that we want to examine in economics, and we'll look at both of those in the sow herd and in the finishing. The turning, or the asset efficiency, and the changing of the cost structure of the farm. Now, there's one other thing that I want to mention, and this has to do with the riskiness of the outcome. So when you have a disease like PRRS, the normal range in which you can expect profitability to lie now increases as well as decreases in total. So in other words, the range increases, the actual outcome travels over a wider range, and then the whole range itself moves. You see, reflecting the either higher cost or lower revenue from the sale of the animals. And that riskiness of income has many issues. Number one, for instance, it often will prohibit you from gaining access to capital at the same volume or at the same interest rate. If you have a high variance income, normally bankers or lenders or investors will not provide you as much money because it's too risky, it travels between too big a range, and they will charge you more for it. So that's a very critical part of understanding the economics of disease. It increases volatility of both costs and returns. Okay, let's take a look now at the breeding herd. And in the example that I'm going to show you today that we've modeled for you, we used experimental data, or data from an experiment that BI performed, which I think you're going to find pretty exciting when we get to it because of what it reveals. And secondly, we've really built it around European cost structures. So you're going to have to make some translations between euros and your own home currency maybe. But that should be pretty easy to do. I think you'll recognize most of the figures because they're common ones in production, but you may have to make some money changes in your head. So we're building it around a 650 head breeding herd, but let's talk about these two principles now in the breeding herd and how they perform when disease happens. First of all, when we think about slowing the turns, we have increased reproductive failure, which means that a sow may be bred, but then not conceive, and so it has to go back to the beginning and start over without having a measured output. And that, of course, reduces its turns. And if you have enough sows doing that, the whole farm average will change. We also have fewer litters per animal per year, and an increase, especially bad, is an increase in late-term abortion, where the animal will go the full length almost of parturition, getting ready to actually farrow and then fail. So now we have to go back to square one and start over, or have a litter which is low viability. Now, if we look at the cost structure side of things, which those are kind of small, so I'll put them up pretty quickly. Increased mummies and stillborns mean we have fewer animals to sell, so our revenue goes down. And increased breeding herd mortality means we have to replace more animals that we normally wouldn't have to in order to keep the herd parity structure proper, and we have the increased cost of veterinary labor and so on. So now let's turn our attention to wean to finish and think through these two big movements, and then we'll look at the example. So we have slowed growth, and when growth slows, some interesting things happen that the typical way of accounting for them it misses. Okay, the typical economic calculation that tries to measure the cost of slower growth misses some very important things, and we're going to show what those are and how much they might impact the actual cost of disease. One of them, for instance, we know that when animals get sick and they eat less, they actually shift their consumption from a mix of growth and maintenance that I'm sure you're aware of to more maintenance and less growth. So an animal at the same weight which is growing slowly, is going to be consuming more feed for maintenance than an animal at the same weight that's growing rapidly. And when this happens, the feed efficiency is deteriorating. We also have increased costs, which affect the net profit. Remember, the unit cost goes up. We have more labor again, more veterinary medicine, this feed intake shift. And then, depending on whether there are profits in the industry or not profits in the industry, we might have a different outcome in the cost of PRRS. So if you remember one thing, and I want you to remember more than one thing, but if you do remember one thing today, if you think of the cost of PRRS as a single number, like $3 per head or €5 per head or whatever, you need to get rid of that idea. All right, because I can guarantee you it's based on inaccurate information. Whenever it was calculated and you believed it, it was probably based on the price of pigs and the cost of feed at that time. So if it's no longer the same price for pigs and cost for feed, that cost of the disease is no longer valid. So we want to show you today a way to calculate or really estimate a more representational cost of disease and of PRRS, rather than what we might call an idiosyncratic one that's only valid under the same price and cost conditions, which may never repeat themselves. Okay, if you look at the literature about how cost of disease is calculated, you'll almost always find that a tool in economics called the partial budget is used. Now, the partial budget is an acceptable, reasonable tool to look at changes on a farm, but it tends to be mostly used for big picture gross analysis. And so it abstracts away from the complexity of the farm. For instance, it uses what I call single pig analysis. And what we mean is we say if a pig in finishing slows from a growth rate of 850 grams to 750 grams, the way a partial budget accounts for that is, says, okay, take one average pig, and what would be the increased number of turns or decreased number of turns that we would get as it dropped its growth rate. And then once you've calculated a cost for that for one representational pig, you multiply it by the number that's in the building. So if you have 500 head in the building, you calculate the cost for one and multiply it by 500. Well, that would be fine if almost all of the pigs in the building were average pigs. But even visually, you will be fooled by the amount of weight variation in a building as you walk through it. So I want to show you today just how wrong using the average can be, and why you need to quit thinking of single pig calculations, because they're really always wrong. And in the case of disease, they exclusively underestimate the cost of disease. And I'll try to convince you of that here in just a minute. So instead of the partial budget, we're going to use a stochastic simulation and optimization process. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, basically, we're going to say instead of choosing one price for pigs, like we would say PRRS struck and we sold 1/3 less animals. So we take that 1/3 less animals and multiply them by their weight and then times a price, right? That's kind of the typical way things are done. Instead of doing it that way, in stochastic analysis, we replace the single price, like the current price, with a distribution of prices that are representative of what prices are likely to be over a period of time, maybe the next 1 to 3 years. And we allow the model then to run maybe 1,000 times, like cycling the farm 1,000 times, and every time it cycles, it randomly picks a price of feed and a price of pigs that are in those distributions that represent possible prices. Now, each of those prices is weighted by its probability of occurrence. So very high prices for pigs, while they may be in the distribution, are weighted very low probability, so they're only selected a very few number of times. Prices that are more typical of what you receive as the model is coming through and cycling again and picking prices, it will pick those more often. And what you get at the end then is kind of every combination of the outcome, for instance, of the cost of PRRS, whether prices are high, prices are low, feed cost high, feed cost low, you know, all of them together, and you get a pictorial representation of all of that richness and complexity. And you also get the ability to do some very nice statistical analysis, which allows you to use confidence intervals. And we'll look at that in just a minute. Okay, so the case I want to show you in the time we have remaining is a 650 sow breeding herd. And in the case, remember, of the partial budget method, the typical thing you would do is say, all right, I'm going to estimate the cost of PRRS. So we know that we believe that the sow is going to reduce turns from, say, 2.35 to 2.1. And we take the single representative sow and we calculate the fewer pigs that you have, and then multiply that times the number of sows in the farm. The problem with that is we've abstracted over, for instance, something as important as the parity distribution. So in the model which I'm going to show you the results from, we model the parity. Instead of picking one representational sow, we model the full parity structure of the farm, the percent of the animals that are gilts, the percent that are first parity. And what you see in these numbers is the mean total born in this case and the standard deviation of total born for a second parity or a parity 1 breeding female. So when the model is estimating the decline in the output of pigs from the farm, it literally goes through the full parity structure of the farm, picking and estimating for every sow in every parity and adding it all up. Now you might say, well, how wouldn't you just get the same answer if you had one weighted average animal? Well, number one, would you like to calculate the weighted average involved in 650 sows with all these different parities and standard deviations? And I'm going to show you that we have in the literature, for instance, a study which shows us that PRRS has a differential effect on sows depending on their parity. So sows which are parity 3 or younger are more severely impacted by PRRS than older sows, typically, at least in the result of this study. So in our modeling, when we do the full rich complexity of what really is going on, we can go in based on what we know about from the literature happens in the sow herd and actually replicate in a much more realistic way the impact of the disease rather than average it over sort of a single sow. Okay, so on average, we're going to now come to the average for the richness that you just saw of complexity. Before disease strikes, we're turning at 2.35 liters, about 14 total born, 12 born alive, almost 11 weaned. So before illness, 25.6 pigs weaned per sow per year. And that represents probably top 20% European performance. So we're working with modeling a farm that's in the really the excellent category for Europe. Now the Danish would say this is average or below average, but we'll talk to the Danish later about this. Okay, I don't want to show you the actual numbers here, but I just want to show you that instead of putting in some kind of average cost for the sows, we have a very detailed budget of all of the costs associated with the sow herd, the electricity that's used and the repairs that are done on the building and so on. So in the model, we're using a very rich cost structure and not abbreviating it or abstracting over it. All right, the simulation, how does that work? Well, the costs that you just saw in that list were harmonized with the last 3 years' costs in the EU. So in other words, we looked at data sets which gave us the cost of electricity in Europe and so on, and harmonized that budget to the European costs. And when we're thinking about the value of a weaned pig that's lost to PRRS, instead of just using the current price for weaned pigs, again, we're going to put in a distribution of the last 3 years' prices for weaned pigs. In this case, you'll notice that it was 43 euro mean and a standard deviation of about 6 euros. So whenever the model, it wants to value the loss of a weaned pig in the 1,000 iterations that it goes through, it reaches into that distribution and randomly selects a price, which would then, you see, sort of simulate the idea that we're looking at it over a 2 or 3 year period, rather than restricting our analysis to what it was today. Okay? So we try to be more representational. Then this is the study that gives us the parity-specific impacts from PRRS. So we included that in the analysis. And then for the cost of feed, which of course is by far the biggest cost in total pig production at least, not always in the sow herd, but in wean to finish, we used European prices for corn and soybean meal from the same 3 year period that the weaned pig prices were taken from, okay, to calculate the cost of the budget. All right. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the way I want you to think about, from today going forward, the total cost of a weaned pig. That's interesting. I've got 2 different slides. Okay, well, you can look at either one. Hopefully they're the same. You know what's going on over there? All right. We're resetting the clock. The one over here is the one we want to be using. All right, while they're fixing that up, I want you to look at the graph on the right, and this is how I want you to think about the value of a weaned pig. What does it cost to produce one in a farm? So you say, well, what does that red picture tell me about the cost? Well, the average is 36.63. That's the average cost of producing a weaned pig. But we know that next month it may be higher, and last month it may have been lower. So what you're seeing in this diagram is the possible costs of a weaned pig and their probability of occurring. So sometimes costs are very high when feed costs are high, for instance, and so they're represented by these high costs. But note the height of the red bar is low, indicating that they happen very infrequently. And then most of the time, the cost of a weaned pig is going to fall in this range when we have a normal crop year and so on. And every once in a while, when we have abundant feed, for instance, and prices are very low, we expect a very low cost of pigs. But this is the way you need to begin thinking about cost, rather than the rules of thumb, which are calculated 5 years ago on some fixed price which no longer apply. But you're using those to determine, for instance, the cost of disease. Think about it as a lot of possibilities, with many of them more likely than others. Now, what happens in the model that we ran when disease strikes? We'll stay over here just in case they're not the same. This is the outcome now when PRRS strikes, the cost of a weaned pig. So the one thing that you're going to notice is the distribution flattens and widens. And what that means is the probability of a very normal price is less. That's the lowering of the middle. And we begin to see more extreme versions of the price. Now, not only does that shape change, but the cost also rises. Whoops. So, instead of an average of 36, when PRRS breaks, we have a new average price of $42.14 per weaned pig, but don't think of that as a fixed number. Think of that as a new higher range of outcomes that are likely to occur. We do have a little bit of problem with the two slides, so I'd like for you to keep your focus over here because this one is not going to move in the proper way until they get it fixed. So we're going to focus over here. Okay, what about net income? This is a picture of the net income or profit per pig in Europe over the last 3 years. And it has a kind of funny shape, but the average was €7 per weaned pig with a standard deviation of about 6.3. Now notice when we do this kind of analysis, we're able to now give a confidence range where we can say 90% of the time we expect profitability to be between a low of about loss of €3 per weaned pig profitability to a high of 16.74 euros. 5% of the time it could be higher, 5% lower. So now we have much more information than expect a $5 decline in profits at PRRS strikes, which is the simplistic and inaccurate way to think about it. Now, what happens to net income when PRRS strikes? Well, we have the change in the shape again, and you see the red emerging in the back, and the shifting down. So we move from an expected profitability of around €7 per head to an expectation of loss of €4 per head, €4 and how much? 36. Yeah, €4.36. Now again, notice the range here compared to here. Instead of 90% of the time being between only a loss of 3 and a gain of 16, we now have a wider range. That's the increased riskiness that disease brings, and a lower outcome. A loss of 21 euros per head up to a profit of potentially 14. Now, I want you to look at the overlap, where these overlap, and you'll see a very realistic representation. What does that tell you? Well, that tells you that in certain cases, for instance, when profitability is very high, even with PRRS, which is the blue result, we can have outcomes of profitability that are higher than a well farm, than a farm that doesn't have disease, when it's facing, for instance, very low profits because of low pig prices or high feed costs. Or another way to think of it is a very, very excellent manager on a farm, even with PRRS, may be able to contain losses and have a better outcome than a very poor manager with well pigs. So you see, now we get the realistic picture of the diversity of the outcomes rather than PRRS comes, lose $5. So we begin to see some things in which we can make better decision making from. All right, what happens now in the breeding herd? We go from 235 to 223. That's the slowing of the turns because of PRRS. The weaned weaned pig for breeding female goes from 25.6, almost 26, down to 20 pigs. So we got reduced output, reduced revenue. Total weaned pigs then are reduced on the 650 sow farm from 16.5, 16.6 down to 13,498. And the average profit per weaned pig drops from an expected value of €7.14 to a loss of $11.50. And that gives us, on a per sow basis, when you account for all the pigs per sow, an expectation drop from €182 profit per sow down to a loss of 88 for a change, negative change of 271. Okay? Now, here's another very interesting thing we can deduce from this. Bottom line, when animals are well, in the last 3 years in European experience, over all the range of prices and costs that European producers faced, you could expect about 84% of the time in a weaned pig operation to make profits of some amount, even if it was 1 penny. But 84% of the time you had profitability. With PRRS, the expectation drops to only 18% of the time that we have profitability. The rest, we can expect some measure of loss. So you see how when we begin to model things with the full data and richness, we begin to get a much more useful picture in trying to, for instance, analyze things like what level of prevention do I want to invest in for my farm? What am I willing to kind of risk, if you will, versus the reward payment kind of trade-off? Okay, let's go to the finishing farm and take a look, because there's a very instructive graph, a principle that I want to show for you. First of all, we know that from epidemiological studies and just from common sense that the typical way we think about PRRS infecting a farm is a fantasy. Now, even though everybody knows this is not true, this is how we think about it. It's one of those ways we reduce reality. We think one day I don't have PRRS, the next day I have PRRS, and every animal has it, and every animal has it at the same level. When somebody tells you so-and-so's farm broke with PRRS, your kind of natural thought about that is, oh dear, all the animals have it. Well, more than likely, it broke with PRRS far before anybody knew that it broke with PRRS, right? Because the way disease enters a herd is often slow and gradual and subtle. And it may depend, it can of course be quick and thunderous, but it depends on where it entered the barn, where the ventilation was with respect to where the entry was, what the movement pattern of animals are around the point of infection or entry of the disease into the herd, for instance. We know from the literature and experience that large farms with, for instance, large gestation barns may take quite a while to get the entire gestation barn exposed to the disease once it enters, because of the distance animals are from the point of infection. So what happens in reality is, instead of the average pig being sick, is we have a kind of an emergence of subpopulations of differently affected pigs. And that makes it very hazardous to use an average to talk about it. The essential issue then of this on the pricing side is, in many countries, the price of pigs is determined by a reference to an ideal pig. So if a pig is much heavier than the packer or slaughterhouse wants, they give a lower price. If it's much lighter, they give a lower price. But in most cases, it's not symmetrical. Like lower weight pigs may be less penalty than heavyweight pigs, or vice versa. So using an average, you see, when you have a distribution of weights across that and a payment scheme that is not symmetrical, introduces lots of error. So averaging the low weight used in a calculation for heavyweight subpopulations really lowers the heavyweight pigs, raises the lightweight pigs, and creates a kind of a set of errors really in understanding. So let me show you visually what I'm talking about here, and I think it'll make a lot more sense. So if I were to ask you what is your growth rate on your farm, you would give me a single number, because I didn't expect you to sit down and tell me what every pig in the barn is growing at, okay? We would have a long conversation. But what we really know is that, and what we have to remember is, probably none of the pigs in the barn are actually growing at the exact number you give me, right? They really grow at a differential rate around that number, a distribution of growth rates. So when you think about PRRS coming into a finishing barn and slowing the growth, we're talking about, in reality, not all pigs growing at 850, but a range of growth rates with an average of 850, right? And we know from a lot of experience and from weighing pigs that this is the general shape of the distribution of growth rates in a barn, even when pigs are healthy. They're not symmetric around the mean. They tend to be skewed in this fashion. So now, if the growth rate were to fall to 725, what happens? Well, this distribution changes shape and slides down, or if in fact subpopulations of pigs have emerged that are some severely affected, some not so severely affected, then the reality is this may be the shape of what has happened. And so the point is, abstracting all of this complexity to an average of 850 changing to an average of 750 is to lose a lot of the accuracy. So let's take a look at this very interesting data that we were able to look at. It was groups of pigs, 10 in each group, that were differentially challenged with the virus, with the PRRS virus. And because there were a relatively small number of pigs in each group, they were able to take the temperature of each animal every day after they were infected for a period of a little over 2 weeks. They were also able to observe every animal every day for about, a little over 3 weeks, about 24 days, I think, looking for three basic behavioral changes that might take place, like more laying down or coughing or those sorts of things. So the weights were taken at weaning and at day 27 and day 70. So for every pig, we have kind of a trajectory of growth, right? We have an individual trajectory beginning of growth. And with that information, we were able to fit a growth curve to every pig. All right, so rather than using in the model an average growth curve, we had a growth curve and a consumption of feed curve matching that rate of growth for every single pig. So let's take a look at what that looked like in reality. I'm highlighting here group number 1 for you, and the color differential that you see is the emergence of fever in the animals. So the red are the higher temperatures and the green are the lower temperatures. And each column is a day. So for instance, this is the day that they were challenged, day 1, and then you have a period of days that their temperature was taken, and each row is a pig. So each group was given a stronger challenge of the PRRS virus of about 10 times the previous group's total. So this is group 2, group 3, group 4, and then we had a group that was not sick. But what I want you to do is look at that, and what you're really seeing is the kind of blooming of the disease process in the animals and how it takes on a different rate and so on. And so the economics blooms in the same way. The economic deterioration of the animal occurs and follows the blooming of the symptoms and for instance, the fever and the inaptitude. So in order to really understand the economics, you have to place the measurement of the values on the biological changes. Okay, so we're going to go quickly through that. It's in the paper. The pigs which were challenged had a 575 gram growth rate compared to the well pigs, which had a 718 gram growth rate. The average daily gain was reduced then about 20%. And then in terms of feed efficiency, these are the amount of feed that was needed per kilogram of growth for the sick pigs, and this was the smaller amount needed for the well pigs, so about an 8% decline in feed efficiency. Now, what I'm showing you is a result of the simulation. These are the profit curves of each of those groups that you saw. So, for instance, what we're going to do is grow the animals out until their profit is maximized and then sell them. And what you'll see is the well pigs reached their profit maximum at day 133, and then the other subpopulations, if we can call them that, are groups of pigs that were differentially infected, had this kind of profit growth, and when it slows and stops, we sell them. So we had a range of days between 161 and 174 for the pigs that were infected in the group. So we'll catch this side up to the other side. All right, so all of them optimized around 105 to 108 kilograms, and we used an EU pricing mechanism that's common in the Netherlands to price them by their weight. So here's the outcome. The net income of the pigs, and again, this will be the better one to watch. This is the net income expectation when the pigs are healthy. In Europe, from a loss of about minus 37 to a profit of about 102 per head for healthy pigs. When PRRS strikes, according to the modeling, we dropped from an expected 22 euros per head to only 10. This was the average of the 4 simulated groups. So in summary, 22 euros per head for the well finishing pigs, down to 10, and in the breeding herd, 714 for the wean pig, down to 428 loss when PRRS strikes. The net change in the finisher then from 22 to 10, a loss of about 12 euros per head. Now, what you're looking at here are a typical set of financial measurements for the whole farm that are carried out often by accountants and provided to managers to understand whether their assets have been profitably used and so on. The first one on the far left is just our net income, and you see the movement now to the left is the loss associated with PRRS. The return on assets, the return on equity, and the return on investment, which many of you are familiar with, when PRRS strikes, we see that shift down, indicating less profitability and less financial efficiency in the use of the assets. Then if we look at the same thing on the finishing side, really we see some different shapes because of the economic differences in finishing, but you'll notice the blue ones, which are the result of PRRS, have shifted down, lowering the outcomes. So our return on investment drops from 8% to about 1. The return on assets from about 12 down to 3. Return on equity drops from 9 to about 2, which would be, expected. So we see not only the mean, but now we see also the distribution of outcomes, which are possible, weighted by their probability. So, in summary, before we go have a beer, right? We have to have some good questions before we have a beer. First of all, of course, as each speaker really has said today, or many of them, PRRS is a substantial negative economic impact, both to the sow herd and to finishing. And the more we understand it, the more we realize that it can't be captured by a single number, but is a more risky range of outcomes which are lower than well animals. We have a substantial decline in the turns of the farm that we talked about as one of the two big economic sort of understandings of a farm, but also the decline in the profitability. And when you look at the analysis of the modeling, you see that even though both of them were affected by PRRS, the profitability was more important in the decline of the outcome than the asset efficiency, the slowing of the farm. The subpopulations of differently affected animals makes using single pig economics very misleading and very inaccurate, especially when that's based on single historical prices or single historical costs at some past date when that number was created. So, I'm not here to give you a new number to replace the number that you have. What you need to remember is that it's substantially lower, it's substantially more variable, okay? And you reduce, for instance, we believe in the sow herd, the opportunity for profitability from over 80% of the time with a well herd to only 18% of the time with a herd which is infected with PRRS. So, sorry about the two screens, but hopefully everybody was able to follow, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. diPietre.